All right, class, this is going to be the first of two lectures on inequalities and intersectionality. I preface this by saying, really this whole course is about inequalities in the United States, but this is going to give us some, again, more foundational language in which to think about these topics, as well as give you some ideas as to where you would like to go with your later papers in this course. Because as a reminder, near the end of the semester, you will need to submit a paper on your own positionality, basically a reflection of your sort of place in US society, as well as a problem or issue that you would like to address, most likely based on a topic you find in this class, dealing with issues of inequalities, dealing with issues of disparities in terms of social class, economic status, religion, gender, sexuality. It's really up in the air, but just know that all of these topics in some capacity intersect with each other. Oftentimes you cannot look at them in isolation. However, in scholarship, this is really hard to do effectively because if you acknowledge that everything does influence everything, which really is reality, it is really hard to say, for instance, that this is the reason you are seeing this particular thing in your field site. This may sound confusing, but I'll give you some examples, especially in the next lecture planned for Wednesday. So a few weeks ago, I had given you a presentation, a sort of mini lecture on your upcoming assignments, and as part of that, I also identified an area on Canvas where you can choose your gender pronouns. Their options currently are a little limited, but if you would like to do so, basically whenever you're writing a post, for instance, it will say next to your name the gender pronouns that you identify as. This is a good way to, for instance, be an ally and make it more normalized that people express their gender pronouns. That being said, it also is perfectly valid to not want to express your gender pronouns, either due to discomfort with doing so or fear of, for instance, being outed. Those are also very valid ways of thinking about this topic. Now, whenever I would do this in person in the classroom, and I would have everyone identify with their gender pronouns if they chose to do so, oftentimes individuals that are cisgendered, so a person's identity identifies with their biological sex, would feel some discomfort in doing so, or they wouldn't understand the point of this. I argue this is because, and the science argues this is because, these are the norms and expectations we have about the world. I'm a man, right? So why do I need to say he, him, his? I'm just a man. However, you can identify as, for instance, a man, but choose they, them, theirs pronouns, either out of wanting to be an ally or just because you feel more comfortable with that pronoun set. Again, completely valid. All of these examples are completely valid. It's just the fact that a lot of these are not normalized yet. It's not normalized that you identify explicitly your gender pronouns. That is why Canvas, I'm assuming, is sort of facilitating the ability for you to choose your gender pronouns now. Because, for instance, when you are writing a post on Canvas next to your name, if you choose the gender pronoun that you identify as, it will say it next to your name. In a sense, starting to normalize this being a more explicit and openly discussed, or at least acknowledged, discussion. I am a feminist anthropologist, among other labels that anthropology likes to give themselves. That being said, it is important to understand feminism and its roots because this really is also a critical perspective that anthropology pulls from, whether they really think about it in terms of feminism or Marxism as another example. So largely, Western feminism developed as the concept of equality for all, regardless of gender, so-called race, or ethnicity. However, in the history of the US, of course, this largely became a hot button topic even in its inception and formulation because there were really very real racial and ethnic barriers in terms of power and inequalities, which of course are still happening today, but they were just talked about differently in the earlier periods of this. Or they were left out of the discussion, which we'll get into in a second. So as I said, feminism takes a critical perspective, pointing out disparities to promote positive change. So it is critical, but also applied in nature. You were saying there is very real inequalities concerning the gender gap, men getting paid more than women. that implicitly is also saying that we should try to fix this. It is applied in focus. How can we get this more normal and equitable for everyone? However, feminism is also a social movement. Actually, you can think about it as multiple social movements that sometimes converge and sometimes diverge. And it is also a research approach. When I'm saying critical feminism, I am talking about really one central thing that most people that identify as a critical feminist kind of all say the same thing. But there is also critical black feminism, which inserts critical race theory into feminism to identify, for instance, disparities in how we talk about feminism and which voices we promote when we are talking about feminism. So feminists, which is not exactly the same as a feminist scholar, they often are, but they do not have to be, often are put into things called waves. In the early days of the suffrage movement, so for instance, women trying to get the right to vote, this is considered by many to be the first wave of feminism. And in terms of time, it is basically within the 19th and early 20th century in the US. Now, is probably a lot of common knowledge for some of you that were raised in the US, for instance, thinking about the prohibition of alcohol also being tied to this. And also it was in response to domestic violence, also tied to the prohibition of alcohol. A large reason alcohol was first banned in the US was due to these early feminists and prohibitionists saying that alcoholism was contributing to domestic violence against women and gender-based violence, really. And that if we banned alcohol, maybe we could make this more equitable and there would be less violence against women. Additionally, this first movement, as I mentioned, suffrage, was also concerning getting the right to vote. So there were a lot of different issues here sort of wrapped into this large wave of feminism. The next so-called wave of feminism you can think about as developing in the 1960s or to around the 1980s with some overlap today as well, because second wave feminist thoughts is still very prevalent today. And this is because, for instance, there are still many people that were from this time period alive today, so their ideas are still percolating around the globe, really. And additionally, in terms of the transference of knowledge generationally, a lot of second wave feminist thoughts in theory was passed on to later generations. So a lot of what I understand as second wave feminism is still largely the public's perception of what feminist theory and thought is, because it is very prevalent. In terms of how we can sort of conceptualize this wave of feminism, it largely is focused on reproductive rights and also women so-called getting out of the house. So for those that are unaware or need a refresher in terms of a history lesson, during the World War II period, when a lot of men in the United States were overseas, also during Vietnam, for instance, also too, largely the workforce consisted of women. And during that time period, women started to see, wow, men have a lot of social mobility and access to work than we do. So women were more mobile. They were getting out of the house, and the house was also a gender understanding and role that women sort of quote unquote belonged to during this time period, versus being the good housewife. However, when men started to return from the war, they expected to be able to go back to the jobs that they once held. What ended up happening is a lot of jobs that women started to become very proficient in and comfortable doing started to, for instance, fire them and hire men, because that was the old norm, basically. However, women argued that you can't restrict our newfound freedom, basically. And this created a lot of different issues and debates and protests in the United States. Additionally, second wave feminists really critique the over-sexualization of women in ads and pornography. This is a really important and probably the most commonly understood aspect of second wave feminism, is this over-sexualization of women. So for instance, on this ad here on the right, and pay attention to this, especially when I'm talking about the next slide as well, You see a woman here holding a sign that says, "Welcome to the Miss America Cattle Auction." And her right sign says, "Break the dull steak habit." And it basically sequesters the female body and physique into sort of choice meats like you would cattle. Second wave feminists argue that as you objectify women, you just see them for their body parts, basically. You detract from and reduce their humanity, basically. So they critique this sort of understanding of gender roles and gender and power relations by saying that men objectify women. And to a certain extent, women internalize and make okay this objectification also, as they are bombarded with ads and pornography also too, sort of showing the perfect woman or how women should behave in the bedroom and also elsewhere. Third wave feminism, sometimes considered to be in contrast to second wave feminism, developed in the 1970s really, and it is still commonly understood as the current wave we are finding ourselves in today. Now, think of the time period in which this started, the 1970s. This is basically right at the tail end of the so-called sexual revolution in the United States, where men and women started to become more comfortable with their sexuality, but especially women, and women as also sexual beings, because we all are sexual beings in that sense. But they were told, women, that you were supposed to suppress that sexuality. Third wave feminism, in contrast, says you should be able to embrace your sexuality as well, because that itself is emancipatory and allows you to have more freedom. You are less restricted and told what to wear, as an example. That being said, think about what the image on the right is trying to convey, and then what the previous image is trying to convey. There is a so-called feminist war that is still sort of going on today with the anti-porn feminists of the second wave feminist movement and the sex-positive feminists of third wave feminism. I'm also talking about these waves as in they are sort of monolithic entities, like you are either a third wave or a second wave feminist, but of course there is going to be some nuance and some overlap as well. But both of these perspectives are trying to say that women are being told what to wear and what to do. They're just coming up with a different solution to that answer. To an anti-porn feminist, if you reduce the amount of porn there is, for instance, men will have less toxic expectations of women. If they see them as non-sexual objects, they will have less expectations of women as sexual objects. Sex-positive feminists say that we should be able to walk around in what we want and do what we want to a large extent. And that itself also is a means to free us from the patriarchy, in a sense, or at least identify the hypocrisy of the patriarchy. So look at the signs here, and then think of Abu Lughod's reading of "Do Muslim Women Need Saving?" Think about what the sign here is saying. Muslim women, let's get naked. I'm a woman, not an object. That sign in particular, think about that, and then think about the previous slide. Both signs say the exact same thing, essentially. They're just coming at it from a different direction. There are some current debates concerning if there may be a fourth wave sort of brewing right now, and there are some really valid reasons for thinking about this right now. For instance, developing as a response to critiques of third wave feminist leadership and discussions being exclusionary of LGBTQ+ and minority perspectives. What this is trying to say is, again, think of that previous slide. What kind of faces and bodies were you seeing there? All white women, yes? This largely has been the face of feminist movements since its inception. This was something that white women supposedly were championing as the leaders in feminist movements. However, this is exclusionary of different perspectives and minority perspectives. So for instance, critical black feminism critiques largely a whitewashed version of feminism that we sort of understand today in terms of what kind of scholarship we cite. So a lot of the times, even though black feminists are saying the same thing, what was happening in our history is that we were citing white women feminists largely. And additionally, white feminists, without really even meaning to do this, We're saying this is the experience of all women. All women are oppressed equally because we are women. However, if you take this into an intersectional point of view, if you are a black woman versus a white woman, there's going to be an extra layer of disparities and racism that can shape your experience of being a woman. Add on additionally, for instance, if you fall within the LGBTQ plus sort of spectrum, or you don't identify as a certain gender, as an example too, but you are female passing, as an example, how people think about you is going to be shaped by their expectations of how the world works and how the world really should work. As I'm saying this, think about the stereotypical feminist in your mind. What do they look like? What is their skin color? What is their haircut like? Are they straight or gay? These are topics that are very weighty and very complicated, but they're also very important to talk about, because these are really the words and understandings we have to sort of shape how we talk about feminist movements and also the critique of the patriarchy and other disparities in the United States, which are shaped by gender and power relations, but also racism and other historical factors. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because I already sort of borrowed from this on a previous slide in this presentation. Which is weird to say because you're watching on YouTube, so there's not really slides, but you get my meaning, I'm sure. Western feminism has been critiqued for focusing on the individual and being whitewashed. Again, what kind of faces do we associate with feminism and being a feminist? That answer could be very different depending on where you come from and what sort of ideals you belong to. On that note, there really are multiple feminisms, so don't think about this again in terms of there being feminism. There are lots of sort of secular or sort of cellular, is probably the better term, feminist sort of ideas and thoughts and understandings. There is Black feminism, there is Latin American feminism, then there's Latinx feminism, which doesn't necessarily mean the exact same thing to everybody. And of course, there are Muslim feminists, there are African feminists in general. Like, really, feminism has become so diffuse that it is being influenced by cultural practices and understandings at the global level as well as at the local level in the United States, as an example. So now we're going to get into a definition of intersectionality, which I've sort of been playing with throughout this class. But before that, here's some historical context. Black women in the United States occupy the intersection of two axes of subordination, race and gender. They stand figuratively at the points where race and gender overlap, at their intersection. Watch this short YouTube clip to sort of get what I'm trying to say here. Basically, what intersectionality is trying to say is that your different ways of identity and ways of identifying yourself, your positionality in a sense, intersect or overlap with each other to shape how you interact with the world and how people interact with you. And that influences your health, your wellness, your mental health, for instance, also too, as you internalize these different levels of disparities that you have to deal with on a daily basis that are historically based but contemporaneously mediated. So in terms of a definition that we're going to be using in this class, you can think of intersectionality as an analytic framework for assessing how factors such as race, gender, and class interact to shape individual life chances and societal patterns of stratification. Again, society thinks about such things as black and white, man and woman, because in the US, we like to sort of fall back on categories and also dichotomies. You're either a man or a woman, you are black or white, and this, of course, leaves out other perspectives. And this can have implications for how you identify as yourself. As an example, Asian Americans largely are left out of a lot of discussions concerning racism in the United States. However, of course, Asian Americans experience racism as well. It's just a different kind of racism, largely, of course. So these are shaped by societal patterns So you can go back to the previous presentation where it talks about what whiteness even means and how that has been historically mediated. Again, for instance, Irish American immigrants were not considered at one point in our history to be white. The same with Italian Americans and some other examples, such as Jewish Americans too. However, your self-identified positionality, for instance, if you identify as a white person, that may come in conflict when it comes into contact with understandings of what whiteness is in the United States. This is where the individual life histories of yourself interact and intersect with culture in general. And that intermingling oftentimes either results in you having to adapt to the culture or the culture adapting to you over time. Now, in terms of anthropology, critical discussions of gender and race, including how they operate within broader social difference, remain largely outside mainstream anthropology. What I'm trying to say here is that we have been good about talking about race or gender, usually not both at the same time. To provide an example of this, my work concerned the Zika virus, a mosquito-borne disease that also can be spread sexually in the country of Belize. I primarily was talking about the experiences of women in the country having to navigate this uncertain space of the government telling you to not get pregnant because of Zika concerns, while also not providing ways to prevent pregnancy or to have an abortion, as an example. So I largely started talking about the economics of the country and how, for instance, it was very costly for women to travel outside of the country to receive an abortion, or to, for instance, buy condoms, when oftentimes condoms were never really favored by men in my study either. They don't like to wear them, essentially. And this has been seen also in the larger data set for Belize in terms of STIs and STDs. What I'm talking about here really is gender, and also gender power relations and economics. What I left out of my previous research is really a discussion of race. I'm talking about men and women, but which men and women am I talking about? Am I talking about Black Belizeans? Am I talking about mestizo Belizeans? There are lots of different also racial categories in Belize that don't line up with that of the United States either. And perhaps that discomfort, or me not wanting to reify any sort of racial understandings about how people should behave, resulted in me not talking about race. I wasn't really engaging with it. I'm kind of race blind in my research. This often happens in research, not just anthropology. When you're hearing reports about, for instance, violence against women, yes, all women experience violence, but which women experience it more than others? And that often is minority individuals in the United States. So anthropology, and other disciplines, to be fair, has a really hard time with approaching and talking about both race and gender. As I mentioned earlier, the more sort of variables you tack on to your research, the harder it is to really say what is happening here. It's better research if done effectively, it's just incredibly difficult to do. So anthropologists, largely, as an example, feminist anthropologists, focus on the experiences of women. But again, what women are you talking about? I have a quote here from my research from a participant. He was a garbage collector, basically, on the island. And he said, "Man, you are wasting your time going that way," as I'm walking through the island towards a certain part of the island. That's the Black neighborhood. They don't give us trash cans there. Manny identifies as a Black man, and what he is saying is I'm going around the island trying to find out where they are putting garbage cans, because litter is a risk factor basically for mosquito breeding. He says there are no trash cans in the Black neighborhood because the government does not provide free trash cans to this neighborhood. To Manny, this is a racial issue, and not something that I would have found out if he didn't bring it up to me. It's not something I asked. It's something he gave to me without really thinking about what that means for my research. To Manny, he just says, oh, what's the point of going over there? They don't give trash cans to the Black neighborhood. But what that tells me, at least in terms of Manny's perspective, is that there is a racial disparity in the distribution of waste services on the island, basically. This gets into environmental justice, another sort of theoretical perspective that says that certain groups or communities are favored over others in terms of their built and social environment. We will make sure the rich area of the island where tourists go to, largely white tourists go to, has adequate waste management services. But we don't really need to worry about that in the islanders' neighborhoods where they actually live, because it's out of sight of the main thoroughfare, basically. There are injustices in the environment which are built on social understandings of the world and cultural factors, which can influence health and wellness, and they become internalized by individuals living in such communities. Manny, for instance, internalized these multiple layers of environmental injustice and racism, and also economic inequalities when I was just walking through the neighborhood and he knew that I was looking for garbage cans, as an example. All right, we're going to get a little philosophical here, so bear with me. There is also an important discussion here concerning conceptions of self and also personhood. In Western philosophy, personhood and free will are largely creations of Western thought and may not reflect an objective reality. For instance, in the United States, our conception of free will and freedom largely developed from understandings of free will in the Bible. You are an individual person. You have free will to enact decisions. You have the agency to do whatever you want. Intersectionality, as a product of Western thought, has been critiqued for focusing on individual subjective experiences exclusively. But this is changing over time. Many non-Western cultures emphasize the family or society, not individual personhood. If we study other cultures, we must also consider this. The United States is a multicultural society. Not everyone has the same understanding of how the world works and what it means to be a person. For some cultures, you are a product and a part of a larger family structure. That family goes above everything else, including your own personal autonomy. You must provide for your family. You must be a good citizen so that your family is not disrespected or slighted by your decisions. You are the son of a familial structure. You are the daughter of familial structure. And that's going to influence how you see yourself in the social ladder of society, and also how you should present yourself to other people. I mention this because intersectionality, again, has been critiqued, coming largely from Western thoughts, as focusing on the individual. It's easier to talk about, for instance, the experiences of a black male in the US who may be gay. That is him. We put a bunch of labels on him. It is harder to say that the reason you are doing this is because of familial practices which shape your ideas and ways of thinking about the world, and it also shapes your own positionality at the same time. Complicated, I'm sure, but sort of think about what this is trying to say about even something that we take for granted, such as free will and personal agency, because it is not a universal understanding across every culture. I mentioned this on a previous presentation as well, but there are also movements in scholarship to try and basically make our syllabi and our readings more intersectional, more inclusive. This largely falls into the umbrella of so-called decolonizing movements. So for instance, there is Decolonize Your Syllabus or Cite Black Women. Both of these movements are trying to say, historically, we are only citing certain scholars. As an example, in classical literature, we talk about largely white men and their writings. When we are talking about classical music, we often play symphonies created by white men. But this excludes other perspectives that are equally as valid. They just don't get as much attention as well. What, for instance, Cite Black Women is trying to say is, okay, this black scholar is saying something different, or maybe even the same thing as this white scholar. Why do you continue to reproduce knowledge created by the white scholar when a more diverse body of knowledge would be better for your education. It's more inclusive and also more encompassing and also more expansive. You may learn things that you would not have learned from citing the same scholarship over and over again and reading the same scholarship over and over again. You're only reproducing that same body of knowledge. Before I engage with this article concerning Black women's erasure and sexual violence on college campuses, I would like you to pause this presentation and watch an 8-minute TED Talk, the very first link here at the top, concerning intersectionality. I think to some degree it would be hypocritical of me to not include the perspectives of Black voices in this presentation. I identify as a white man and I am white passing. That's how people see me. So if I'm sitting here behind my digital podium and talking about the experiences of Black women or Black individuals in the US, it is sort of my responsibility to do this effectively is also to incorporate the perspectives of individuals that identify with those communities. So pause this video and watch at least the first 8 minutes of this TED Talk. It's very salient in terms of what's happening today. And also it can give you sort of foundational understanding and language in which to think about these issues. So I'm pausing here briefly, but then I'm going to assume that you watch that first 8 minutes. Okay, so as the article says, a race-neutral approach to policy and programming development where victims and survivors are never contextualized regarding salient legal and sociocultural histories between different racial groups of women in the USA. This very long sentence is saying that when we talk about victims and survivors without contextualizing them, we are practicing in some degree erasure of their perspectives. There are very real barriers and also perceived barriers to reporting sexual assault on college campuses. For instance, as you've probably heard in either an introductory module when you entered the university or just heard the topic brought up, sometimes victims or survivors internalize their experience as somehow they were at fault. Additionally, sometimes when you do report sexual assault or violence, you could feel that you are either airing out what happened to you when you'd like to keep it personal, and that can cause more trauma in itself, or you can believe that if you do report, nothing will get done, or your name will get dragged out in the public for everyone to see. In terms of nothing getting done, this also has racial implications and barriers, as the article went into great detail. If we are just talking about victims and survivors, we're kind of, in a sense, also whitewashing the discussion. We are talking about the victim, the survivor. We're not talking about, for instance, Black women experiencing higher rates of sexual assault on campus. We're just talking about assaults on campus. That extra layer of intersectional disparity is important to contextualize, because otherwise we are just talking about women in general. And again, the experience of every woman is not the same. Many women can and will experience sexual assaults in their life, but there are other factors that can influence the consequences of the sexual assault and also the rate of sexual assaults among communities. And you can think of the college campus as a large multicultural community. That's really what it is. But the policies, almost by necessity, have to be very much cut and dry or agendered or asexual as well. There has been a movement to change the focus on the rape survivor, as an example, onto the perpetrator of rape. And there are a lot of merits to doing so. Putting the focus on the rapist in terms of, and instead of the person that has been raped, has a very real function in terms of how we think about this issue cognitively. The focus of even the sentence of us talking about, for instance, sexual assault can influence how we think about it, either a passive or a very active act. There's a scholar here I'm going to have you also watch for the first 8 minutes, again, at a minimum, And he goes through this sort of ways of us thinking about the language we use when we're talking about sexual assaults in the United States. So give that a watch, especially pay attention to when he's using his sort of whiteboard and the linguistic change he is doing and what that can mean about how we think about sexual assaults on college campuses. Expanding a little further, race neutrality in policy is a manifestation of a colorblind social ethos in the USA. Think of ethos as culture, basically, where to identify race is to be racist. Think back to the Gravely reading. What this is trying to say is that, for instance, if there is a policy that particularly says we need to have mechanisms in place for Black women experiencing sexual assault, this may be construed as you favoring one race over another, despite the fact that there are very real reasons to have policies in place that can help certain individuals based on their intersectional identity as well. However, in the USA, which practices sort of racial blindness, we don't talk about race, so it doesn't exist. That can have consequences because then again you're practicing erasure where you're not talking about a very real issue. Thus, racism persists through discursive means while disguised as racial sensitivity. This is that so-called post-racial society I've brought up before. There's this thought that in the United States, if we don't bring up race, it's not going to be a problem. But racism and race are also internalized understandings about the world, of course. And basically all this ends up doing is being counterproductive. There is still racism going on, but we can no longer speak about it because to speak about it can be construed as being racist. This has implications in terms of legality because universities are trying not to get sued, for instance. And there is a possibility that if they make policies, for instance, let's say white males that are sexual assaults perpetrators on campuses, that may be construed as being a racist policy, despite, for instance, demographics and statistics showing higher rates of sexual assault by white males in the United States. Additionally, colorblind or race-neutral policy privileges and normalizes whiteness. This is sort of white normativity, which I brought up before, while masquerading as the equalization of all races. Again, the sort of expected norm in the USA is that you are a white individual. This, of course, is not the case, but think about also who policymakers largely are. The majority of policymakers are white males. So they see the world in terms of the lens of being a white male. That biases their way of thinking about the world. Without meaning to do so, it just happens. This is not to say that every white man is inherently trying to enact policies that are detrimental to other genders or ethnicities, but there's something about their upbringing, this applies to all of us, which shapes our way of thinking about the world. I do this thing, so this is how you are supposed to do things on a certain topic, as an example. By not accounting for racial difference, sexual violence policy often promotes the sociocultural values and understandings of such violence from the perspective of white heterosexual women as well. Think about this in terms of heteronormativity. There is also white normativity. You are either a man or a woman, and you're either largely black or white. And that being said, pulling from that discussion, the sort of modal woman we think about in the United States is a white woman. That's what we see in advertisements. That's what we see in terms of talking about feminist movements as well. This is not an entirely white woman's movement in feminism, but that largely is the podium and platform we are providing to discuss feminism. It is the face of feminism, basically. This, of course, is changing over time, but we're talking also about history. Remember, you can't really disentangle history from politics, from history from culture. They're all intertwined and they come together and compound each other to influence how we think about the world and the policies that are enacted, which have consequences on our physical bodies as well. There is another term here, and it's called hidden curriculum. It is the unwritten, unofficial, and often unintended lessons values, and perspectives that are taught to us. It is a mechanism of hegemony. Remember, hegemony basically is us implicitly giving power to policymakers or authority figures. Since we give them power, they have the ability to enact policies that can influence our social status, our own biology even, and our way of thinking about the world. In terms of, again, citing Black women, if there is a hidden curriculum of only citing white men, this is never something that is written on a syllabus, I'm going to cite only white men. But if every scholar is a white man, this implicitly starts to change our perception of who a scholar is and what is valid research as well. This applies also to the hidden curriculum of whiteness being embedded within sexual assault policy in higher education. The assumed victim of sexual assaults in policy is a racial individual. But, as I mentioned on the previous slide, when you don't talk about race, what ends up happening is you only really think about one race, that is the white race in the United States. Powerful and pervasive ideas of Black female promiscuity and, by contrast, white female purity ultimately reinforce existing structures of power in our society, and is a form of colonial misogyny and white supremacy. This is a very loaded statement, so let's think about this for a second. There is a pervasive thought that Black female or women individuals are promiscuous, and this is contrasted by this cultural understanding and perception that white women are more pure, or that their purity needs to be maintained. This, of course, does not reflect in the actual reality, but these are sort of stereotypical, very problematic understandings and expectations of other groups and individuals. This, of course, is rooted in racism in the United States and colonialism in the United States also too. There was the hardy Black body versus the fragile white body. We must protect white women. We don't need to be as cautious when we are dealing with Black men or Black women. This even applies to slavery in the United States, of course. It's really hard to disentangle this historical context because it has shaped the very real consequences of a topic including sexual assaults on campuses, seemingly very divorced from slavery hundreds of years ago. But these understandings build on each other, and culture changes sometimes very slowly over time, and very real disparities due to racism and sexism can come together and converge to influence our understandings of the world and the consequences of those understandings as well. Only once more from the article, I'm going to provide an example of symbolic violence and structural violence, two terms which I've already identified in a previous presentation, in terms of this article. Rather than explicitly examining the distinct experiences of sexual violence for Black women versus white women, all women are lumped together in a homogeneous group, where disparate concerns and needs are inconsequential. If you're lumping Black women and white women into one large group, what ends up happening is largely the experiences and understandings of white women become normalized as the expectations and experiences of all women. This is because, again, of the inherent biases a lot of individuals have in terms of being a policymaker, being a police officer, or having a position of authority. This is why it's very important to have diverse perspectives in positions of authority so that we can start to change these implicit biases over time. It's a difficult thing to do. It's a difficult thing to argue for because, again, in the United States, there's a very real discomfort with talking about racism. Again, if we bring it up, that sort of invokes that white discomfort with the topic. But that discomfort is also a space for us to start to change perceptions over time. In terms of structural violence, this is most evident in terms of policy. If policy and programming pay no mind to the reality that Black college women may feel pressured to be silent about their assaults, then Black women will never be adequately reached for support. If we're not talking about the experiences of Black women in sexual assault policy, then Black women may feel there is no venue or avenue in which for them to talk about this topic. Enacting violence on them through a combination of symbolic violence in terms of racism, implicitly or otherwise, as well as policies in place that are so-called agendered or a-racial. So that is it, at least for now. The first quiz of this semester, and there are a few of them, just keep that in mind, is going to open up on Wednesday, February 10th. This is the day that I had on the syllabus that it was due, but I'm going to give you a little extra time just so you can get through all the material. It's going to close on February 14th, Sunday of the week. So keep that in mind. You have a few days to complete it. Spend that time, if possible, catching up on the readings, lectures, etc. Because the quiz, in terms of what can be covered on it, is really everything is fair game. That includes, for example, lectures, documentaries, readings, podcasts. So just make sure that you are caught up and you have a bit of time on the quiz. In terms of how the quiz is structured, again, primarily we're looking at true, false, multiple choice, and then short essay questions. So I have confidence that you all can do this in the time that is allotted for you. Just make sure that you get it done and don't wait to the last minute so you're not stressing out. And that is it.